coastal archaeology is rapidly changing our view of British history. It's a vital tool for archaeologists to understand better how we lived and worked in the past.
Every day on a sandy beach or a rocky foreshore, intriguing evidence of our island history appears and then disappears as the tide rolls out and rolls back in again.
The area between high and low water marks is known as the Inter-tidal zone. And at low tide, the sea reveals its bounty.
That is tiny!
Investigating these fragmentary remains brings to life the story of Britain's coastal history.
Archaeologists are enthusiastic about their discoveries, but they're also worried. Extreme weather can expose long-hidden remains. At the same time, these conditions can damage or even destroy our valuable archaeological heritage.
And so, because there's no guarantee this legacy from the past will survive into the future, coastal archaeologists are busy identifying what's most at risk. This week, we're in the northwest, on the border between England and Scotland, looking into the intertidal archaeology of the magnificent Solway Firth. We'll be asking why one of the Victorians' great feats of engineering failed to stand the test of time.
The structure is to all intents and purposes destroyed. Blimey.
We'll be trying to discover who built this timber oval in the sea and why.
Oh, that's so clever. It's not only beautifully built, so much thought has gone into it from design onwards.
And we'll be investigating the cause of a tragic mining accident that took place 4 miles out to sea.
It's the worst accident in the Cumberland coalfield, right away.
On a spring tide, the Solway Firth has a tidal range, the difference between high and low tide, of around 25 feet, one of the largest in Britain. To explore the archaeology here, we'll obviously have to work around these very variable tides. We're starting on the English side of the estuary, near a place called Bowness on Solway, where the low tide reveals clumps of ironwork and broken blocks.
Hard to imagine actually that just that way is the Lake District, and then if you kept going that way you eventually hit the Highlands, but
Yep.
right now with that border between Scotland and England.
It's so flat. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's bleak.
Yeah, today I imagine it's pretty nice on a sunny day though.
You feel like you're at the end of the world. There's nothing else for miles around, and then you stumble across something like this.
This is way too much building work for it to be a jetty, isn't it?
No, this isn't a jetty. This was actually a viaduct. It was a single-track railway that linked the town of Annan over the other side with Bowness just behind us. It was actually the longest viaduct in Europe when it was built in the 1860s, over a mile long.
Over a mile?
Yep.
It's a whopper.
It's huge, isn't it?
I just love this. It's kind of all these beautiful, like, giant dressed sandstone blocks. They're all higgledy-piggledy, and then the columns. It's kind of like the Parthenon.
It certainly is. They do have a neoclassical feel about them, don't they, these columns? Actually, if we get a bit closer, we can have a look and see kind of how they were made.
So what are they made of?
So they're cast iron pillars, and they're hollow, because actually you can see there's a big hole. And then the cross braces are wrought iron.
What about these letters?
Yeah, they're nice, aren't they?
Yeah.
I just spotted those. I'm wondering whether or not they're a bit of a nod to how you construct something as massive as this to go over the river, because we've got all the Ds just at the top there on these central columns, the uprights here, but at the edges, we've got D1s marked on there, and I'm wondering if that's kind of the flat pack assembly instructions. So maybe just here we've got row D, we had C, B, and A back there, and it might progress across the river, and these just telling the engineers which bit to fit where.
What is it, a mile?
Yeah, just over a mile, yes.
over a mile
yeah,
that
just
way.
over a mile.
I mean, that's so much effort to go a mile this way, it must have been worth it, yes?
It knocks about 30 miles off the journey to get around the other side to get there. So if you think about a time saving, it's a huge investment, but the payoffs in terms of time are massive.
Well, I have done that journey from Annan all the way around to Bo'ness, and it is a pain. You think it would still be useful to have a bridge connecting the two. I mean, you think, what happened?
Yeah, it's true. I was thinking exactly the same thing. If you've got a structure here, a useful structure, why not maintain it? Why not keep using it?
These are the ruins of the Solway Viaduct Bridge, and they raise intriguing questions. Not only about the viaduct's past, but about transport in this region today. There was a bridge here once, why not now? And when exactly did it disappear? What on earth happened to it? Just around the corner from the viaduct is Port Carlisle, once the port for the city of Carlisle, 11 miles inland. As the Industrial Revolution got underway, Carlisle had difficulties bringing in supplies from the coast. So to solve the problem, they built this port and a canal to link it to the city.
Be careful, there's a lot of mud.
Yes.
While the tide is out, Charlotte is meeting David Ramshaw, who has researched and published a history of Port Carlisle.
So where are you taking me then, David?
Well, I'm taking you onto the stone dock. It was built here in the 1830s.
Right.
And it was to allow big ships to get into Port Carlisle, much bigger ships than had arrived here prior to that.
And what were these big ships carrying? I mean, why did they need it here?
Well, they were carrying things like coal and cotton.
Right.
That was needed by the industry in Carlisle. The problem with Carlisle is it being left behind in that all of the industry in Carlisle depended on water power.
Right.
And they could not afford to convert to coal because it was so expensive. It's quite a high dock, as you can see.
Yes, it is.
Stand
It
back
gives
from
you
the
some
edge,
idea
yeah.
of the size of the ships that were coming in here then, doesn't it, really?
Yes, 500-600-ton ships. There's a painting showing a very large coaling ship here, and they're unloading it onto this dock. Previously, Carlisle was suffering in the early 19th century because the coal there cost 4 times as much as it did at Maryport in the west, where it was mined.
Blimey, why is that?
Well, the only way of getting coal to Carlisle was down the Solway, which is a very shallow estuary.
Yeah.
And then it was all horse and cart all the way into Carlisle.
Oh, I see.
And that was why the canal was built.
The 11-mile-long canal was to carry goods from Port Carlisle to the city. Work began on it early in 1820. Initially, it provided much-needed labour for the poor of Carlisle. But the scale of the project meant there were outsiders as well.
The building of the canal brought in a lot of navvies from all over, many from Ireland, they said, you know, and...
I hear they're quite notorious.
Yeah, they're quite notorious, yes, and there's articles in the paper about how on a good Sunday a pub was stripped of all its liquor and there was rioting in the streets, you know, carrying on fighting and so on.
So it really is just kind of falling into the sea, isn't it?
Yes, 20 years ago when I first came here, all of this was level.
Wow.
And all of this below us was right up to the top of the wall. And with successive winters, it's gradually getting washed away and it'll go eventually.
Yeah. So this dock, bringing in these huge, great big ships, must have seen a real change to the area. What sort of impact did it have?
It had a fantastic impact, particularly on the people. It was just the same effect as the space age coming to us.
Yeah.
Suddenly they were getting goods coming into Carlisle, things they'd never seen before, such as coconuts and exotic fruits of one sort or another.
That must have been quite a thing.
And all the industry developed because coal was cheap. And so over a period of 35 years, Carlisle really expanded. We had the biggest biscuit factory in the world, Carr's Biscuits. People were a lot better off. Everything had changed, all in that one generation. And then 1860s, the ships could no longer come into the Solway here because of a new viaduct being built. But it had happened, and Carlisle was much better off. And by then we had the railways to carry the goods.
The availability of cheap coal meant the city of Carlisle continued to grow into an industrial powerhouse. Famous for its textiles, its biscuits, and its engineering. The beauty of the Solway Firth today reflects the fact that the economy here is predominantly rural. But there's another industry that's on the increase: tourism.
As other parts of the region become increasingly congested, people are finding a new appreciation for this coastline with its hills and mountains and huge, wide skies. It's been designated an area of outstanding natural beauty, and tourism here has an interesting history.
I'm crossing the Solway now into Scotland, heading for Powfoot, an old seaside resort 4 miles west of the Viaduct. I'm joining Ellie Graham and Nick Coombe, who are trying to make sense of this unusual intertidal feature.
It's a beautiful thing, but what is it? We're not 100% sure. Local consensus is that this is a swimming pool, but it's quite unlike any other intertidal swimming pools that we see elsewhere in Scotland. It's really quite different.
All the intertidal pools that I think I've seen and visited in England have been concrete, rectangular. I mean, is this concrete?
No, this seems to be made of really large timbers, actually. So if you just clear the seaweed back. Yeah, they're great big, possibly oak pieces of wood with metal sort of strapping and banding around the outside as reinforcements, which is really unusual.
It's quite exquisite. A lot of work has gone into this.
Absolutely. There's a lot of wood in here. Someone's invested a lot of effort in building this for some reason, yeah.
Any idea when it was built, how old it is?
Well, there's various theories about it, but one of them is that it was built as a paddling pool for children after a drowning in the late 1930s. And it was because of the big tidal range, so that children didn't have to go out there to paddle. They would only have to go here, and it would be a safe place for them.
Yeah, well, that does make some sort of sense.
Another story is that the soldiers billeted here were involved in building it as well. In the Second World War,
yeah.
So again, 1930s.
And are there photographs?
There's nothing that we can find, which is really odd, because it is the sort of thing that people would take holiday snaps of. You know, you're on your summer holidays, you're down swimming in a paddling pool. There would be photos or postcards or something.
Yeah, there's lots of postcards of the hotel and the village, but none of this structure.
It's a complete mystery.
Complete mystery.
It's not a mystery. Are there any clues from the structure itself, though?
There is this central strut that runs down the middle. It could have been potentially separating two different sexes. The other thing we think it might have been to separate like a deeper end and a shallower side. Or even, believe it or not, it can sometimes get a little bit wild and windy here, can't it? So we think it might even have been like a sort of reinforcement to sort of stop the worst of the waves and the wind from damaging the structure.
Yeah.
So you need to find out, you know, what it's really made of, what's at the bottom, whether one side's deeper than the other in one day. I'm going to leave you to it.
Thank you.
Ellie and her team are lucky. The tide here can be out for up to 6 hours. While they try to make better sense of the archaeology, I want to find out when the swimming pool was built and by whom. It's hard to imagine now, but back in the 19th century, this was a busy waterway and industry was a priority. One of the natural resources of this region was an iron ore called hematite. In the 1860s, iron was needed for the railways, for shipbuilding, and for bridges, including the Solway Viaduct. I'm meeting author Anne Lackey. She's been fascinated by the viaduct for years. I want to find out how it benefited life on the Firth.
It seems obvious to have a bridge connecting these two sides of the Firth. Why suddenly was 1860 the time in which they started?
It was all to do with West Cumberland, as it was then, the hematite trade, the iron ore. And between 1861 and 63, the amount being produced trebled. It was just extraordinary. There was no way of treating it in West Cumberland, so it had to go an extremely long route by railway, up to Carlisle, and then a dogleg round to Gretna, and then over to Lanarkshire, to the furnaces there. So they obviously had this idea, well, let's just cut off the corner. We'll build a viaduct.
When you stand here and you look across there, I mean, it's a good mile or so.
A bit more than that, even. The viaduct ended up being about 2,000 yards long. I mean, it wasn't just a few piers across, it was 193 piers between here and Annan. And they had to be built in the Firth, that was the thing.
How did they do that?
They had 2 barges which were pulled out by a steam tug twice a day, according to the tides. And apparently there was no scaffolding. So what they did, they carried the girders on top of the piers, and then the barges had cranes which just dropped them down. Quite an amazing feat.
The viaduct opened to freight traffic in September 1869 and to passengers the following summer. By then, the project had cost £100,000.
It was described in lovely Victorian flowery language as a light and elegant structure resting on the bosom of the waters.
It just must have been slightly terrifying, but also rather wonderful. You know you're on this huge, heavy steam locomotive, you know, it's like huffing and puffing, but from that height, yes, it must have just felt like you were being held up by matchsticks.
That's right. When they first started, they reckoned that by cutting off the corner, they'd reduce the cost of transport by £1 a tonne. There was something like 200,000 tonnes of iron ore, hematite, a year would be going across.
Okay, gosh, okay, that's a lot of shillings.
That's right.
So they were hopefully in it to make loads and loads and loads of money.
Right.
Did they?
No. No, it all went a bit wrong, really. The trouble was it took so long to build, and there were so many problems along the way. The price of hematite was dropping.
Why was that?
The globalisation set in. There was Spanish iron ore coming in much cheaper. And so the maintenance was pretty high, as you can imagine. It was particularly badly damaged in the really bad winter of 1881.
Despite all of that, would you describe it as a success?
No, economically it just wasn't a success at all in the end. But as a piece of beautiful architecture, stunning architecture, it's a great shame it's gone.
And remarks about the bad weather of 1881 are interesting. You'd think that however severe the winters, a structure as massive and strong as a viaduct could withstand them. What on earth went wrong? The viaduct bridge dominated the landscape of the Solway Firth. If it were damaged or forced to close by wintry weather, local newspapers would probably have covered it. Oliver and Charlotte are visiting a library in Dumfries, where they keep back copies.
Friday, 4th of February, 1881. February, that's bleak midwinter.
It's going to be a bit nippy, isn't it?
Yeah, let's have a look. Ah, yeah, top of the page, look. Serious disaster to the Solway Viaduct. A large portion wrecked by ice. The structure is to all intents and purposes destroyed. Blimey. Numberless pillars and large portions of the girders and permanent way have been carried off by large floes of ice. Large floes of ice taking out an iron bridge. I mean, they must be icebergs. On Saturday night, 4 watchmen kept on duty on the bridge. They heard the ice bumping and rattling against the bridge, and at times they heard noises resembling the shot of a gun.
Wow.
Which led them to the conclusion that some of the pillars were being snapped.
I guess these pillars are all going to be hollow, aren't they? So I can imagine the kind of rumbling,
reverberating,
such a huge iron structure. But the sound of the gun, that's a heck of a wallop.
That is.
Any more details?
Let's have a little look. Oh, look, Board of Trade inquiry. They spoke to a whole load of people here, look. John Brown, resident manager of the Solway Junction Railway.
Here we go, look. The ice was never in my recollection in such large quantities on the Solway. One piece I measured was around 7 yards square by 6 feet thick.
Crikey.
That's big enough to put a polar bear on it, isn't it? That's huge.
He kind of goes on to say, there was a large quantity of ice in the Firth. I never saw it come down so much in a body before. That was owing to the want of wind. Ah, that's interesting. Yeah. When there is any wind, the ice gets broken up and driven on shore. So, it was very cold, very still, the ice wasn't getting broken up.
We've got deep freeze, haven't we?
Yeah, a deep freeze, the tide's moving quite fast, and it's like Skittles in a bowling alley. Just got like a bowling ball.
Of the viaduct's 193 piers, 45 collapsed in January 1881. The railway company had no choice but to close it. The necessary repairs took 3 years.
Right, we're on to 1884 then.
Ah, here we go, top of the page. The reopening of the Solway Viaduct for passenger traffic took place yesterday. The viaduct has been reconstructed in a manner that will save it, it is hoped, from falling a victim to any similar invasions by the Ice King. That's quite a nice way of saying it. And it is probable that many years will elapse before a storm of a like character occurs again. So they're kind of hedging their bets. On the one hand, they have kind of reassessed the structure and kind of adapted it, but they're also hoping that we're not going to get really, really bad weather like that again.
Yeah, so I mean, they can't predict the future weather, can they? But I guess in a period of such confidence in engineering, they're kind of hoping they've solved the problem, haven't they?
Why was the winter of 1880 to 81 so exceptional? How did such icy conditions come about? What's undoubtedly true is that in recent years, coastal erosion has been increasing. We've seen evidence of it all around the British coastline, and here on the Solway Firth, one example has a particular poignancy. Oliver is heading west now to Whitehaven, a large coastal town facing the Irish Sea, which grew in the early 18th century as a result of coal mining. Some of the collieries they built extended several miles under the seabed. One of the largest and most distinctive was Wellington Pit. Designed to look like a castle, it began producing coal in the 1840s.
Hello, John.
Oliver is meeting John Brown, himself an ex-miner. John's familiar with the remains of Wellington Pit and its tragic history.
After many years of being covered over by all this pit waste here, 2 or 3 years ago, the sea started to wash it away and it's now become exposed again.
What is it?
It's part of the original Wellington Pit buildings. It was a round tower which can be seen on photographs of the site. It stood right at the western corner of what was originally the courtyard.
This was intended to be quite the project, am I right?
It certainly was a sort of prestigious development. It originally intended to sink the shafts down to almost 2,000 feet, drive 3.5 miles out to sea.
So 3.5, 4 miles out there, it's going to take quite a while in the morning to get there, isn't it?
Just over an hour's travelling time each way.
For the actual miners themselves, what do you think it would have been like?
The fact that there's so little air reaching the working places would make it quite hot and stuffy. You're talking about temperatures 70, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It's always been regarded as a very, very gassy coalfield. The seams themselves are very gassy, and if you don't have adequate ventilation, you quickly reach a situation where the concentration in the airstream is getting very dangerous.
There was a bit of an explosion, as I understand it?
Yes. 1910, fire and explosion resulted in the deaths of 136 men. Probably it's the worst accident in the Cumberland coalfield by quite a way.
The explosion at Wellington Pit took place on the evening of Wednesday, the 11th of May, 1910. It remains one of the worst mining disasters in British history, and the records relating to it are substantial. Can they tell us what actually happened? On the Solway Firth, you really feel this is border country. I'm hopping back over the Firth to follow up on the Powfoot swimming pool story. I've arranged to meet Duncan Ford, the ranger for the Hoddam and Kinmount estate. The Brooke family, who own the surrounding land, have opened up their archives to us. We know Edward Brooke was keen to turn Powfoot into a popular health and leisure resort. Can the archives give us any clues to the origins of the swimming pool?
Edward Brooke buys the Kinmount estate in 1896, which includes a large area of land down at Powfoot, and very quickly looks to develop it further for holidaymakers.
Right.
So In the estate offices, we have a series of letter books, copy letter books. They contain the letters to Edward Brooke himself, because he spends a lot of his time away from this region, and so they're giving him just regular updates on the work in progress. And it's in those letters that we find the first mention of the swimming pool. So this is 1899.
29th of April, 1899.
And it says Tilburn, so that's William Tilburn. He's an engineer, a contractor from Dumfries, and he undertakes a lot of the work at Powfoot. And it says he's getting favourable weather for the swimming pond and has all the piles driven in centre division and has commenced the circle.
Ah, that's totally it. It gives you a real insight into how it's been built, because they started with the centre division. That is a lot earlier than anyone thought.
Truly. You get a little bit more, and it's just snippets, but they build a bigger picture. So it's a letter of the 17th of July. I'm favoured with your letter of the 15th and accept your offer to excavate 6 inches deep in bottom of pond and fill in 3 inches thick of good, clean, rough gravel and lay 3 inches of concrete on top of it.
It's got a hard bottom.
Answers that question, doesn't it?
How much did that all cost?
Well, we have 2 letters. So the first one says, I enclose cheque for £500 sterling, be into account of work at New Bathing Pond at Powfoot.
That is a lot of money, right?
We think that's in the equivalent today of about £50,000.
What?
And that's only half the story, because there's a later bill. I have to acknowledge your letter of the 6th, enclose an account for constructing swimming pond at Powfoot, showing a balance in your favour of £516 2 shillings, cheque for which is herewith enclosed.
That's over £1,000.
Over £1,000.
In 1899,
Absolutely.
so £100,000 thereabouts today's money. Was it a success?
By all means it was for many years. We have a letter from a couple of years later that kind of testifies to that. So now we've moved on, so it's now July 1901, and over here it says, Powfoot is busier this year than ever it has been, and last Friday over 800 people spent the day there from Dumfries and district, accompanied by 2 brass bands.
Brilliant! That's brilliant.
And then the telling bit is here, Nelson is keeping the ponds clean, and they are largely taken advantage of by bathers.
Must have been a nightmare to keep clear, though.
That probably is long-term why it stops being used, that there is again a letter from 1905 that says that in winter it fills up and throughout summer it has to be flushed out every single week. So we suspect that the Second World War probably put paid to its maintenance.
These letters have at last solved the mystery of the date the pool was built. Nothing to do with a swimming accident or soldiers during World War II. Instead, it was part of the ambitious vision Edward Brooke had for his seaside resort. One thing's for sure, Brooke's swimming pond has withstood the test of time better than the Solway Viaduct Bridge. But then, it didn't have to contend with the wintry conditions of January 1881, when ice in the Solway Firth seriously damaged the viaduct's iron pillars. Why was that winter so bad? I've arranged to meet Alistair Dawson at the University of Dundee to find out.
Everything I've heard about the winter of 1881 makes it sound pretty chilly. Was it unusually cold that year?
There was almost continuous severe cold from after New Year through to the end of the month, the last week of the month, when things started to rise a little bit. This map that we see on the screen is for the 26th of January, and the thing that is immediately obvious from this map is that the whole of the British Isles has temperatures under the number 30, which is below freezing.
One of the things that's interesting to me about the whole Solway Firth is, of course, you've got a tidal estuary, so you've got a lot of salt water in the system, and salt water freezes at a lower temperature. And was it cold enough for that?
No, it wasn't, because the freezing was of the fresh water. Fresh water was coming down the rivers. It was coming in any rainfall that there was, and in any snowfall. And the fresh water, because it's less dense than salt water, forms effectively a lid over the top of the salt water, and it'll freeze more easily. But this ice will only last as long as the low temperatures last. And ultimately, when the air temperatures start to rise again, it'll start to break up and melt. That's what happened around about the 26th of January, and this mass of ice moving in currents and moving vertically with the tidal changes started to break up. Individual blocks and ice were moving in all sorts of directions according to the wind and where the currents were.
So
and they were crashing into each other.
When I think about ice, I definitely think about stillness. But the picture you're describing is actually really dynamic. The tide coming in, things breaking up, things moving around. It feels very different.
It's a very violent landscape, and the crashing of the blocks against each other would have sounded like explosions. The sea ice that you see on the screen is from the Bering Straits in the Arctic. The only difference between those images and the Solway is that the ocean there is a lot deeper.
You really get a sense of how much force is there, and each one smashing and smacking against each other. How long did the cold winters persist for?
The temperatures did fall to those sorts of levels, but never for as long, and never giving the opportunity for so much sea ice to form.
So it would appear that the engineers couldn't have saved the viaduct. The wintry conditions were so out of the ordinary. But the viaduct did reopen in 1884. How much longer did it survive? A far worse disaster was the explosion under the seabed at the Wellington pit. We're visiting the Record Office in Whitehaven, the town traumatised by the tragedy. So the explosion happened on the 11th of May 1910?
11th of May, around about 7:30 p.m. in the evening. There's a report of a rush of air coming out of the shaft, which is indicative of something catastrophic happening below.
An explosion or something, crashing down and forcing air out. Yeah, OK. So that's where everything began. And then presumably from that point onwards, it was all about working out what happened and then trying to mount a rescue.
It was, yeah. I mean, we've got some accounts from a Richard Walker Moore, who was one of the engineers at the mine, so kind of an inspector, really. It took fully 18 hours with relays of men to accomplish a short distance of 140 yards into one of the shafts. So what that's about 128 metres. So it's not a long way in 18 hours. And they were being held back by the fire getting hotter and hotter, and the ventilation not being able to sort of hold out, and it was driving the men back. The smoke was just too much.
So this is from the 14th of May, so it's made the national news. On Thursday night, that's one day later, they were still trying, but it was seen that the situation was all but hopeless, but still the rescuers could not be deterred from making one final effort.
So many people will have had friends and family down there that every last effort is going to be made by those guys to go and get their colleagues out of the mine.
6 of the miners survived and were reunited with their families. But that left 136 men and boys unaccounted for. It was the early hours of the morning before there was any further news. Just after 2 o'clock, the silence that had endured since the departure of the rescue party was broken by the clanging of a bell. And you know that when that bell rings, it means that people are coming up the lift. And you just got to hope that that first face you see is somebody who you care about. And who was it? Mr. Atkinson, the inspector.
The last person you want to see.
So you've got a fire in a coal mine, so you've got very flammable material down there, so it's only going to spread and spread and spread.
It is.
What are they going to do?
So yeah, the very end of this letter from the 23rd, look, it was deemed advisable to wall off the return airways, and this has been done, which is just a really matter-of-fact way of sealing an awful lot of fate.
All they can do is brick up the pit, starve the fire of air, and then at some point come back and just uncover the bodies that have been entombed there.
This kind of shows you the effect and the impact of that decision. Look, we've got presumably some of the relatives of the lost miners who are just stood on the local beach, sort of gazing out to sea.
The bereaved womenfolk and their friends gave way, and pathetic scenes were witnessed. You used to be standing there and staring out of the place where you know that 900 feet below, that's where, well, your loved one is probably dead, but if they aren't dead yet, they certainly will be soon. Nothing you can do about it. The explosion and fire that took place at the Wellington pit in May 1910 scarred the community of Whitehaven. On the 100th anniversary, a memorial was erected to the memory of those who died. For many people, the decision to seal up the mine was wrong. Oliver and I are looking into what happened afterwards.
I thought you'd like to see the official Home Office report that was published in early 1911. You can see here, this table is a list of all the miners who were killed. It lists their names, their addresses, age, when and where they were found, and also their personal effects and clothing, which were used to identify them because the bodies were so decomposed. And we can see here John Dalton Lucas.
The first guy they found on September the 27th, and his bait tin was full, and so was his water
bottle. That was important to record because it would give an indication of how quickly the man was likely to have died. He wouldn't have had chance to drink his water if he was killed very soon after the explosion.
Did the report, did it tell, I mean, presumably it went into great detail to reconstruct the course of events and what went wrong in the first place?
It did. The Whitehaven mines were notoriously gassy. That means that there was a lot of methane, or fire damp as they called it, and that was very explosive, of course. It just needed a spark to set it off. You can see here in the report, it lists all the occasions between January 1909 and March 1910 when gas, fire damp, was recorded in the mine. Gas was present no less than 49 times in the mine.
God, just 49 times in 1 year.
Yes.
And any one of those could have been, you know, an incredibly dangerous explosion, but it was number 50 that turned out to be the big one.
Yes.
It's the perfect storm, isn't it?
I mean, how on earth would an explosion even start?
Well, the most likely explanation would be something to do with the lamps.
We have here in Moore's letter, then, we've got some evidence of lamps being involved, perhaps. We found a safety lamp near the bodies, the glass of which was broken in a remarkable manner. I'm inclined to think that the lamp which was found was the cause of it.
So it was just a tiny spark from a lamp that was supposed to be... it was supposed to be a safety lamp. It's called a safety lamp, which is just there.
So something so minor led to 85 women being widowed and 260 children in Whitehaven losing their fathers.
One lamp potentially causing all of that damage.
Indeed.
The tragedy that happened underneath the sea here at Whitehaven has gone down in history as one of the worst disasters ever to occur at a British colliery. I've now returned to Powfoot to see what more has been revealed of the swimming pool. I've got some useful information for Ellie and Nick, but have they answered the questions we started with? Why is it divided? Is one side shallower than the other?
Hello!
Oh, hi there!
Hi! You won't believe what we found out in the archives.
Go on, spill the beans
It's
then.
not 1930s at all.
No?
Really? All of those stories, well, I don't know if they're apocryphal, but they've all probably got relevance, but it's much, much earlier.
Go on then.
There's like documentary evidence that the Edward Brooke
started building this in 1899.
Over 100 years old.
Yeah,
this
so
thing's
like
been sitting
April
here.
to over across the summer, like there's a concrete floor. Did you find that?
Well,
Concrete
something
floor?
very hard anyway.
There we go,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
concrete, gravel and concrete,
Right.
concrete floor. And by 1901, it was going great guns. So it's much older.
What we found out is that, yeah, there is a hard floor under there. We hit that, and there's no difference to the depth either side. So it wasn't a shallow end, deeper end thing.
But the most important features Ellie and Nick found were some sluices, used to drain the two halves of the pool.
So there's two sluices, one either side of this division. This one, on this side, has been raised up.
Yep.
And that one down there is still dropped down and in its original position. So this side would have been holding water, and this side would have been draining and emptying out.
You could shut one side off, open the other, that would flush the water out, and then you could open the valve at the top end, and that would continue to flush the water through and take the silt out.
It's really ingenious.
So I wonder if this is actually not about segregation and not about different depths, but just about managing the problem of the silt that's being deposited. So if it's in there just for structural reasons, and to allow them to do that thing of holding water in reserve on one side, to use that as a reservoir to sluice out the other side.
That's so clever. It's not only beautifully built, so much thought has gone into it from design onwards.
It's a really clever system for managing the problem in this sort of dynamic environment where the sea's just depositing heaps of sand with every tide. Yeah, they knew what they were doing with this engineering.
Now that its history has been clarified, and once it's been cleaned up, perhaps Powfoot swimming pond will enjoy a revival. If that is, health and safety regulations permit. Back across the estuary, we're keen to find out what finally happened to the Solway Viaduct. We know it reopened after the damaging winter of 1881, and it was still in business right through the First World War. Then, in 1921, it was reassessed. The bill to put it right had rocketed to £70,000. There wasn't the money, so they closed it down. No one knew whether it would reopen. Charlotte and I are visiting Carlisle Record Office, where they've turned up some interesting letters.
It's like it opened, what, 1869? So it's been going on for over 50 years.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's a whole generation of people who have grown up
with having it, yeah.
relying on it there.
I don't think that they kind of just let it go, because it seems to have caused some kind of stir in the community. There's a letter here which is dated the 5th of January 1922 from the clerk of the Cumberland Council to the Caledonian Railway Company. And he's saying, I shall be glad if you could give me the reasons for such closing and tell me whether there is any likelihood of the service being recommenced at an early date.
Did they get a reply?
7th of January, yep, so 2 days later, so that's pretty good. And this says, by reason of the unsatisfactory character of the ironwork of the Solway Viaduct, the Board of Directors decided some months ago that the railway would not be kept open for traffic working. And then he goes on to say, I much regret that it is not possible to indicate when the railway may be reopened for traffic.
Oh, but that's also interesting because it's not suggesting that it's totally done for.
No.
No. Here, look at this, see? 10th of May, 1922. They're writing, actually, again, it's the Clerk of the Council, writing to G.H. Askew, who's manager of the Brayton Domain Colliery Company.
Oh, right.
I think it might assist our case with the Caledonian Railway Company if you could assure me that if the line is reopened, your company will be able to send coal by that route to Silloth. That's really interesting, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah, because it's obviously sort of saying, look, we need some big industries, we need to have some backing.
It also gives you a sense that they realise that the public vote isn't going to be enough, that they're going to have to get the money behind it.
Absolutely.
See if anything comes of that, though. 22 May... 17th of May, 1922. A recommendation has been made to the effect that merchandise traffic should be worked between Brayton and Abbey Junction.
Well, that's interesting, because I thought they closed it because structurally it was unsound. But it's sound enough to send freight going over, but not passengers.
3 days a week, apparently. But they go on to say, no inquiry has yet been made as to the restoration of a passenger service, and following on such consideration, I shall further communicate with you. So they haven't decided on whether they're going to reopen for passenger traffic. It's still going to be put under consideration.
Well, I have here a letter dated the 7th of July 1922, and that does give us our answer. The loss attaching to passenger traffic working would be very great, and unless a suggestion can be made as to recouping the company, I regret that I cannot hold out any hope of a service being provided. And that was that. It didn't reopen.
No.
The bridge was dismantled. By 1935, it was gone. What is quite interesting is that it was so well built that they needed to use explosives to get some of it out. They initially started out saying structurally it was unsound. Actually, that wasn't.
It's all about the money.
For over 50 years, the Solway Viaduct Bridge dominated the skyline of the Solway Firth. It provided a swift connection between England and Scotland, and the communities on either side came to depend on it. But in the end, economics did for it. And an area that was once brisk with commerce is now silent and picturesque. The British coastline has an extraordinary diversity of important intertidal archaeology. When the tide goes out, we find ancient jetties and prehistoric forests, Roman pots and Tudor forts. The intertidal zone is always changing, always revealing. We can follow in the footsteps of prehistoric people, explore the hardware of world wars and our industrial heritage, excavate international trading vessels and the harbours that once serviced them. And for the time being, before they're destroyed by coastal erosion and storm surges, once or twice a day, we can all visit these sites and stroll around the gallery of intertidal masterpieces.